The scan came back clean on the first pass, which was how Orrven-Dass knew something was wrong. He had been a customs officer at the Venfor transit station for 9 years, and in 9 years he had processed approximately 40,000 vessels through secondary inspection. And in his experience, a ship that came back clean on the first pass was either genuinely clean or had been prepared for the first pass specifically. The genuine cases were common. The prepared cases were rarer, but they had a particular profile, certain mass inconsistencies, certain power draw signatures that did not match declared equipment, a quality of deliberate orderliness in the manifest that was different from the organic orderliness of a ship whose operator kept good records because they were organized, and the same as a ship whose operator kept good records because they were expecting to be checked. The human freighter, registered as the Perihelion, out of the Aldrich Station resupply network, declared cargo, agricultural equipment, and inert soil amendment compounds, had a manifest that was, he thought, slightly too organized. Not conspicuously, just slightly. He had spent 9 years learning the difference. He flagged it for physical inspection and sent the boarding notification. The Perihelion's operator met him at the airlock. She was a human woman, which he had noted from the registration, and she was in her middle years by human reckoning. He was not expert at human age, but the combination of the silver-streaked hair pulled back from her face and the quality of physical capability he could see in the way she stood suggested someone who was not young and was not past prime. She was wearing a work suit with the specific wearing in of a garment that had been used for field work in various conditions, and she had the hands of someone who worked with them, which was a thing he noticed because he noticed details. Her expression, when he came through the airlock, was not the expression of a person who had been caught. It was also not the expression of a person who was performing not having been caught. It was the expression of a person who had been expecting this and had decided at some prior point on her approach to it, and was now implementing the approach with the calm of someone who had made their decision and was at peace with its consequences. This was a different expression from most of the ones he encountered in secondary inspection, and it was one he did not immediately know how to categorize. "Customs officer," she said. She did not say it with the specific warmth that people used when they were performing cooperation, which was its own kind of tell. She said it as an acknowledgement of what he was. "Orrven-Dass, Venfor Customs Authority," he said. "I'll need access to your full cargo hold." "Yes," she said. "I'll walk you through it." The hold was organized in a way consistent with the manifest for the first third of its depth. The agricultural equipment was there, real and correctly tagged, and the soil amendment compounds were there, real and correctly tagged. He scanned them and noted them and proceeded toward the rear section, which the mass data suggested contained something the manifest did not account for. The rear section contained crates, 47 crates, stacked in a pattern that was space-efficient and temperature-regulated, each labeled in a small, precise handwriting that was not a commercial label format but appeared to be a personal cataloging system. He took his scanner and held it to the nearest crate. Seeds. He scanned 6 more seeds. Different varieties across the crates. He could see from the scanner's preliminary analysis that the genetic profiles were varying significantly, which meant these were not a single crop variety but a collection of distinct plant species. He ran a deeper scan on the labeling system and found that the small handwriting was a classification code: genus, species, origin location, collection date, viability assessment, cold storage protocol. He stood in the rear cargo hold of the Perihelion and looked at 47 crates of carefully cataloged seeds and looked at the human operator who had been, as promised, walking him through the hold, which appeared to mean standing at a respectful distance and watching him work. "Seeds," he said. "Yes," she said. "Undeclared." "Yes," she said. He looked at the crates. He looked at her. She met his gaze with the same quality of calm, which he was now finding somewhat more complex than he had initially, because calm in this context usually belonged to a particular type of operator, the type that had done this enough times to stop being frightened by it, which told him something, and the type that had concluded the operation was worth the risk, which told him something else. "Where are these going?" he said. She named a planet. He pulled it on his pad. It was a Druukai mining concession, current operational status, extraction complete, environmental rating, severely degraded, population, 0 permanent residents, administrative classification, post-industrial dormant. "There's no one on that planet," he said. "No," she said. He looked at the crates again. He looked at the labeling system. He pulled the scanner's deeper analysis, which had continued to process while he was looking at the human, and read the preliminary results. His pad showed him a genetic profile cross-reference. He read it for a moment. He read it again. "These aren't crop varieties," he said. "No," she said. "These are." He checked the analysis again. Several of these species profiles are flagged in the Interspecies Environmental Database as status extinct in natural habitat. "Yes," she said. "That one," he said, pointing to a crate in the middle of the stack, "is flagged as extinct, unconditionally. No surviving populations, no institutional seed banks, no recorded specimens post the Druukai Extraction Period." "It's not actually extinct," she said. "There were surviving specimens in the crust rock on the eastern plateau. The Druukai survey missed them because they were reading for mineral density, not biology. I found them on my fourth visit." He stood in the hold for a long moment. His scanner was in his hand. He had a clear violation of the Interstellar Commerce Transit Authority's undeclared biological materials provision, which was a serious violation with a fixed penalty structure. And he had approximately 47 crates of evidence and one human operator who had said yes to every factual question he had asked with no apparent intent to dispute any of it. He said, "How long have you been doing this?" She considered the question in the way of someone deciding what scope to answer at. "On the Perihelion, 11 years, she said. "Before I had the Perihelion, I was working as a survey contractor for the Aldrich Resupply Network, and I was doing it then, too. 15 years in total." 15 years, he said. "Yes," she said. "How many planets?" She thought about it. 19, she said. "Though 3 of those are still in early-stage establishment, and I wouldn't call them stable populations yet." He said nothing. He was doing the work of processing a situation that was not a situation the ICTA undeclared biological materials provision had been written for, which was creating a specific difficulty because the provision was what he had and the situation was what was in front of him. "Come forward," he said, and walked back toward the main hold and then to the cockpit area, where there was a working surface. He put his pad down. He looked at her. "Tell me the rest of it," he said, not as an interrogation, as a statement of what was needed before he could continue. She sat on the edge of the cockpit console in the manner of someone who had been on her feet all day and was taking the opportunity. She told him the rest of it in the way she had answered his questions, directly, with the specificity of someone whose facts were in order and who saw no reason to dress them in anything. She had started, she said, with a planet called Varroth Minor in the Druukai Outer Extraction Belt. It had been a forested world, not a large one, not a remarkable one by interstellar standards, but a forested world with a specific ecology that had been functioning for, she estimated from the geological record, several 100 million years. The Druukai had finished the primary extraction in 9 years, which was efficient by extraction standards, and had left with the minerals and left the rest. The rest was stripped overburden, compacted extraction roads, and soil chemistry altered to the point where the original ecology's recovery window was, by standard environmental modeling, approximately 300 to 400 years. She had been part of the survey crew that came in after extraction to document the site for ICTA's Environmental Remediation Registry. The Remediation Registry, she said, existed to document post-industrial planetary conditions and was a condition of the Druukai extraction license and had no remediation funding attached to it, which she had not known before she went and had found out while she was there. She had spent 3 weeks on Varroth Minor documenting the site for a registry that would confirm, with great accuracy, how degraded the planet was, and would then file that confirmation in an administrative database where it would remain until the 300 to 400 year natural recovery window had elapsed. She had found, in the overburden on the southern slope, a stand of something the site database said should not exist, a species that had been declared ecologically extinct at the Varroth Minor Extraction Completion Survey, small and low and surviving in a protected microclimate in a gully that the overburden hadn't quite reached. She had looked at it for a long time. She had taken samples. She had taken more samples than the survey protocol required. She had, she said with the same calm, taken considerably more samples than the survey protocol required. and she had stored them in the Aldrich Survey Crew's climate-controlled sample bay without entering them in the manifest, and she had, at the end of the survey contract, retained them. "You stole the samples," Orrven-Dass said, "from an extinct species on a stripped mining world with no residents and no recovery plan," she said. "That is not a distinction the provision accounts for," he said. "No," she said, "it isn't." He looked at his pad. "And then you returned to Varath Minor." 8 months later, she said, "I had spent the 8 months reading everything I could find on ecological restoration for post-industrial sites and talking to 6 people who had done academic work on the subject and acquiring the soil amendment compounds through the Aldrich Resupply Network standard agricultural channels, which is legitimately what they are." She paused. "The agricultural equipment declaration is also accurate. You need specific equipment to do the initial soil preparation. And the seeds were undeclared on that trip as well," he said. "I was working for a survey contractor," she said. "I didn't have a cargo license then." "You have one now," he said. "Yes," she said, "and the seeds are still undeclared." A proper declaration would have required an ICTA biological transport permit, she said, which requires an institutional affiliation and a remediation project registration with the Environmental Remediation Office, which requires a sponsoring government entity and a multi-year funding commitment and an environmental impact assessment conducted by a certified third party. He was familiar with this process. He had processed the paperwork for several legitimate remediation projects in his 9 years. The process took, in his experience, between 3 and 7 years and a quantity of institutional resources that was not available to an individual operating a mid-size freighter. "So you didn't apply," he said. "I applied," she said, "once, on Varath Minor, 7 years ago." She looked at him with something that was not quite irony and not quite weariness, but had the quality of both. "The application was still in process when I finished planting the 3rd biome sector. I withdrew it." He looked at his pad for a while. He had his scanner results and his manifest violation and his legal framework, and he had a human woman sitting on the edge of her cockpit console who had just told him she had been replanting ecologically extinct species on stripped mining worlds for 15 years without institutional affiliation or government sponsorship or certified third-party assessment, with personal funds and a mid-size freighter and a cataloging system written in small, precise handwriting on the sides of crates. He said, "The planet you're going to now, what's the status of the previous sites?" She looked at him for a moment in the way of someone revising their model of the situation they were in. Then she said, "Do you want the full assessment or the summary?" "Full," he said. She gave him the full assessment. Varath Minor, the original site, was in its 7th year. Ground cover at 83% of the southern slope, canopy establishment beginning in the gully zone. Soil pH recovering ahead of the model she had built from the academic literature. She had visited 4 times since the initial planting. She had adjusted the species mix on the second visit based on what was establishing and what wasn't, which had required her to source 2 replacement species from off-world, which had been their own logistical problems. The species that had been declared extinct at the extraction completion survey was establishing. She described the establishing. She went through the other sites. She had notes. She pulled a battered physical notebook from the cockpit console and read from it, occasionally correcting from memory when the notes were abbreviated. The notes were detailed in the way of someone who had been keeping the records seriously for 15 years, not as documentation for a process, but because the information mattered and she was the only one who had it. He listened. He was a customs officer. He was not a biologist or an environmental scientist or a lawyer or a policy official. He was a customs officer at a transit station who had flagged a ship for a mass inconsistency and had come aboard with a scanner and a provision and was now sitting in a cockpit listening to 15 years of ecological field records read from a battered notebook by a human who had decided 15 years ago to do something about a thing that was not her responsibility and was not fundable and was not going to be addressed by any of the existing institutional processes in her available timeline. He thought about the provision. The provision covered undeclared biological materials, transport with a fixed penalty structure, fines on a per-unit basis, cargo seizure, potential transit license suspension depending on quantity and prior violations. The penalty for 47 crates of biological material undeclared across multiple transit events over 15 years would be significant. It was not a discretionary provision. The calculation was what the calculation was. He thought about the species she had described establishing in the gully zone of Varith Minor, which had been declared unconditionally extinct. He thought about these two things at the same time for a while. He said, "How do you finance this?" "Survey contracts," she said. "I've been doing survey work for 20 years. I take the contracts in the extraction belt because they pay better and because they give me site access. I live on the Perihelion." She said this last part with the neutrality of a statement of fact, and not as an appeal to his sympathies, which he noticed. "You make enough from survey work to fund 19 planetary restoration sites," he said. "I don't fund 19 planetary restoration sites," she said. "That's not what I'm doing. A funded restoration site has an assessment and a staff and an equipment budget and a regulatory filing and a multi-species impact matrix. What I do is bring seeds and soil amendment and time, which I have, and plant things which I know how to do. The planets do the rest." She paused. "They want to recover. The biology wants to recover. It just needs something to work from." He sat with this for a moment. He looked at his pad. He looked at the notebook, which she had closed and was holding with both hands in the manner of something that was not a prop. "The planet you're going to," he said. "The Druukai concession. What's the plan for it?" She told him the plan. It was specific and sequential, and based on the soil chemistry data she had collected from a survey contract 3 years ago, which she had taken specifically to get the data, and on what she had learned about the site's original ecology from the pre-extraction records, which she had found in the Druukai Mining Company's archived environmental impact filings, which were public record. She had identified 12 species that had been native to the site before extraction, and that she had viable seeds from other sources, some from sites she had already worked, some from the ICTA's Agricultural Seed Exchange, which technically permitted research acquisition of non-commercial varieties, which she had used with a research justification that was, she acknowledged, somewhat flexible in its institutional affiliation. "Somewhat flexible," he said. "The institutional affiliation was myself," she said. He stood up. He walked to the cockpit window and looked at the transit station's exterior, which was ordinary and procedural and entirely unlike the contents of the conversation he had been having. He thought about the provision. He thought about what the provision was for, which was the prevention of invasive species introduction into ecologically sensitive environments, the prevention of biological weaponization through transit, the prevention of commercial black market in restricted biological materials. These were the legislative purposes. They were in the provision's prefatory text, which he had read during his training and had not read since, because provisions were applied, not interpreted, in his daily work. He thought about whether any of those purposes were served by seizing 47 crates of seeds destined for a stripped mining world with no residents and a 300 to 400 year natural recovery window. He turned back from the window. "The species you found in the gully on Varith Minor," he said. "The one the database has as unconditionally extinct." "Yes," she said. "You said it's establishing," he said. "It's establishing," she said. Slowly. "The soil chemistry is still wrong for optimal growth. But it's there. It's alive." He sat down again. He put his pad on the working surface. He looked at it. He looked at her. "Here is my situation," he said. "I have a manifest violation. I have 47 crates of undeclared biological material. I have a 15-year history of transit events, which I do not have documentation for, but which you have represented to me in this conversation as involving the same conduct. The provision has a fixed penalty structure." He paused. "I have discretion over how I characterize the violation in my inspection report." She looked at him, not with hope particularly. She had the expression of someone who was listening precisely and not filling in the conclusion before they had heard it. "I could characterize this," he said, "as a commercial black market operation, undeclared biological materials transported for profit. That characterization produces the maximum penalty structure and a mandatory transit license review." She said nothing. "I could also characterize this," he said, as a private environmental action, undeclared biological materials transported for non-commercial ecological purposes by an individual acting outside institutional channels due to the absence of available institutional channels commensurate with the need. He paused. That characterization still produces a violation. The penalty structure is lower. The cargo seizure is discretionary. She was looking at him with full attention, which was the only way she seemed to look at things. "I'm not going to tell you which characterization I'm going to use," he said, "until I have asked you one more question." "All right," she said. "The species in the gully on Varith Minor," he said. "When you found it, before you took the samples, when you were looking at it in the gully the first time, what did you think?" She was quiet for a moment. It was not a silence of calculation, he could tell, because he had spent 9 years watching people calculate silences, and this was not that. It was the silence of someone actually answering a question that required an actual answer. "I thought," she said, "that it had been there the whole time, through the surveys and the extraction and the remediation assessment and all the years of administrative process. It had just been there, in the gully, doing what it did. Nobody had been looking." She paused, and I thought that somebody should. He picked up his pad. He began writing his inspection report. He wrote for several minutes while she sat on the edge of the cockpit console and the transit station went about its ordinary procedural business outside the window. He wrote a characterization. He filed it. He put the pad down. "I'm assessing a fine," he said, "for the undeclared biological materials. The fine is calculated on a per-crate basis at the non-commercial rate." He named the amount. It was not a small amount. It was not the larger amount. "I can pay that," she said. "You'll need to provide a route plan," he said, "for the Druukai concession visit and any subsequent site visits this transit season, and submit it to the Ven 4 authority. This is for my records." She looked at him. "Route plans are not a provision requirement," she said. "No," he said. "It's a personal requirement. I want to know where the sites are." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Why?" He looked at his pad. He thought about how to say what he was going to say, which was not a thing he had planned to say, and which he was now saying because it was, as far as he could determine, accurate. "There is a provision," he said, "within the ICTA environmental remediation framework, not the undeclared materials provision, a different provision that allows a customs officer to flag a site for enhanced transit facilitation status if the site meets certain ecological significance criteria. Enhanced transit facilitation status means that biological materials shipped to that site receive expedited review and conditional pre-authorization pending a simplified declaration process." She was watching him with the full attention. "The provision was written," he said, "for institutional remediation projects with government sponsorship. It has been applied to, in the history of the Ven 4 station, 0 non-institutional projects." He paused. "The provision does not, on review, specify institutional affiliation as a criterion. It specifies ecological significance." He looked at her. 19 sites, some of them with extinct species establishing. She looked at him for a long moment. He watched her process this, which took some time, and which she did visibly in the particular way of someone who has been working alone for 15 years and is encountering an unexpected variable. "You would need the site documentation," she said carefully. "I would," he said. "Thorough documentation. The field notes." He looked at the battered notebook. The kind of records someone keeps when they're the only person who has them, and they understand that the information matters. She looked at the notebook in her hands. She looked at him. He said, "How long is your cargo?" She said, "I have time." He found an additional chair from the storage cabinet behind the cockpit. He sat down across from her with his pad ready. She opened the notebook. She had 15 years of field notes. They were, as he had assessed from her manner, thorough. She read, and he recorded, and outside the window the transit station continued its ordinary work. And somewhere in a gully on Varith Minor something that had been declared unconditionally extinct was establishing in the wrong soil and doing what it did, as it had been doing all along. Now that somebody was looking. They were there for 4 hours. At the end of it he filed the enhanced transit facilitation flags for 12 sites. There were criteria he was interpreting with some flexibility. He was a customs officer, not an environmental scientist, and his interpretation would need to be reviewed by the ICTA's Environmental Office, which would take between 3 and 7 years, and in which time the flags would remain in provisional status, which meant they were operative. He walked her to the airlock. She had the notebook and her battered work suit and the expression she had had when he boarded, which he now understood better. Not the calm of someone who had made peace with consequences, exactly, but the calm of someone who had long ago decided that the work was worth doing and had organized their life around that decision and was at peace with the organization, which was a different and more considered thing. Orrven-Dass, she said at the airlock. Yes, he said. The provision you found, she said. How long did it take you to find it? He had found it during the 4 hours of field notes, on a search of the framework database he had run while she was describing the third site. He had not looked for it before. It had not previously been a thing he had any reason to look for. Today, he said. She looked at him. Thank you, she said, and meant it precisely, without making it larger than it was, which he had come to expect. Submit the route plan, he said. I will, she said. She went back into the Perihelion. He went back to the station. He processed the inspection report and the fine and the enhanced transit facilitation flags, and a brief personal notation that he added to the site file, which was not a formal document and was for his records only, which said, Varath Minor, Southern Slope, Gully Zone. An unconditionally extinct species is establishing there. Someone found it. It had been there the whole time. He sat at his station for the remainder of his shift and processed the other ships in queue, which were ordinary and procedural. And at the end of his shift, he went to the framework database and read the full text of the undeclared materials provision and then the full text of the environmental facilitation provision, and then several adjacent provisions, which he had not read in 9 years and which were in several cases more flexible than he had assumed. He made notes. He was a customs officer. He had a fixed framework and a fixed penalty structure and 40,000 inspections behind him, and the provision had been what it had been and would continue to be what it was. He was also a person who had spent 4 hours reading 15 years of field notes about what happened when someone decided that the work was worth doing, and he was discovering, at the end of an ordinary shift at an ordinary transit station, that provisions were applied and also interpreted, and that interpretation was a skill, and that skills, in his experience, improved with practice. He began practicing.